Ray tracing. It's been available as a graphics card feature for more than 6 years now, but has it delivered on the promise of a revolution in PC gaming graphics? That's something that we're going to explore in detail across a 2-part series exploring ray tracing visuals and performance in 37 games. We want to find out how much of an improvement is ray tracing versus traditional rasterization in a typical game? What sorts of ray traced effects are most impressive? How many games are truly delivering a great experience with ray tracing enabled? And what's the performance cost in games where ray tracing actually provides a visual benefit? This investigation is going to open up a lot of doors in the lead up to a new graphics card generation. We're going to find out what the best ray traced games are for benchmarking. We'll determine how important ray tracing is as a feature. We're going to revisit first generation ray tracing GPUs and see whether they've lived up to their ray tracing promise. We're going to uncover the real performance difference between NVIDIA and AMD GPUs in ray tracing when looking at games where ray tracing is actually worth using. And I'll probably say ray tracing so many times in this video that your ears will bleed. This video is part 1, looking at the visual improvements that ray tracing provides versus standard rasterization across 37 games, spanning everything from recent releases right back to early ray trace titles. In part 2, knowing what games actually benefit from ray tracing visually, we'll explore the performance cost of enabling the best ray tracing implementations. There are so many visual comparisons to go through that I'm only going to cover roughly half of them in this video. But if you want the full breakdown of all 37 titles, there's an extended cut, fully narrated, available for Patreon members and YouTube channel members that's probably about an hour long. Throughout this video, I'll be categorizing ray-traced games and configurations into 8 tiers of increasing quality. The worst 2 categories are games where ray tracing hurts visuals and games where it has no impact. Then there's a bunch of categories where ray tracing has a limited impact. So games where you have to pixel peep to notice the improvement, games where ray tracing changes the visual presentation but it's not obviously better, games that have improved visuals but also worse artifacts, and games where ray tracing only affects some parts or surfaces in the game world. And lastly, the 2 best categories for ray tracing, games where the feature makes the visuals noticeably better, and the ultimate category, where ray tracing transforms the visuals and adds significant realism. I'm focusing on games that implement hardware-accelerated ray tracing, which takes advantage of the highly touted and advertised architectural improvements of modern GPUs. Some features in games that don't use ray tracing hardware have also been described as ray tracing or software-based ray tracing, such as Unreal Engine 5's software Lumen, as those features also run on cards that don't support ray tracing, at least hardware-accelerated ray tracing. They sit in a gray area between rasterization and hardware-accelerated ray tracing. So I decided to stick to games with hardware ray tracing support. Also, there are now some games being released that only support a ray traced presentation, such as Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora and Star Wars Outlaws. This video is all about comparing raster to ray tracing, so they've also been excluded, but that doesn't mean those games are bad examples of ray tracing. And we're only covering in-game ray tracing settings. Any special hacks, tweaks, setting file adjustments to add more ray tracing or improve the ray tracing is not really the focus of this video. All the visuals you see in this video were captured at 4K using the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4090, and with a couple of exceptions, I've tried to use native rendering or DLAA for the best image quality. We're going to be playing a bunch of games throughout this video where you'll have to guess which of the images is the ray traced version, so crank this one up to YouTube's 4K quality and enjoy. I'm going to work my way through the worst examples of ray tracing to the best examples, so we'll begin with Dead Space. This game uses ray-traced ambient occlusion, and you'll have a very difficult time trying to figure out which image is ray-traced. Turning this setting on does subtly change the way ambient occlusion is rendered, but the difference is negligible and ultimately pointless. The ray-traced image is not obviously more realistic or better than using the standard rasterized version of the game on max settings, and while actually playing, you just won't be able to tell the difference. Even I have difficulty spotting what has been improved when zooming in to view static shots. A relatively recent game with a poor ray tracing implementation is Resident Evil 4 from 2023. This game has a couple of ray traced settings, but I'm focusing on the highest settings here, which enable ray traced light reflection and refraction. In some situations, you'll see minor differences on water surfaces with ray tracing on, and generally the ray traced image looks better, But in other scenarios, I noticed ray tracing would actually remove reflections, like in this example on the boat surface. Most of the time, ray tracing has no impact whatsoever, even on surfaces you expect could benefit from ray tracing, making the feature completely pointless. And this is on the game's highest ray tracing setting. It's amazing they even bothered with a setting lower than this, because I'd say the high setting is equivalent to low or very low ray tracing in other titles. A companion to Resident Evil 4 is Resident Evil Village, which actually features more ray tracing effects than RE4, despite being the older title. This game apparently adds ray-traced global illumination, ambient occlusion, and reflections, but I'm not convinced the game is better off for it. First of all though, try to spot which of these examples is ray-traced. There's definitely differences in this kitchen scene, with many surfaces affected by the changes in global illumination, but this is the image where ray tracing was enabled and set to the highest settings. Now, in my opinion, in most scenes like this one and others we'll run through, Resident Evil Village looks better without ray tracing enabled. This is a dark, spooky, atmospheric horror game, and more often than not, ray tracing makes the image brighter, and this results in less of that atmospheric appearance. It may be the case here where ray tracing is technically more accurate, but the handcrafted, rasterized visuals, in my opinion, are more in line with the overall look and feel of a Resident Evil game. Even in this kitchen scene at the start, the RT image might be technically what this lighting setup should look like, but the darker and higher contrast rasterized image is closer to the right tone for the opening of the game. But ultimately, this is a subjective assessment, and some people will prefer the ray traced image in this title. A Plague Tale Requiem implements ray-traced shadows, and the impact on in-game visuals is subtle. In most scenes, it was pretty hard to tell where ray tracing was having an impact, as the regular rasterized shadows in the game on max settings look pretty great most of the time. Ray tracing cleans up some self-shadowing and produces softer, more realistic shadows at times, but in other scenes it has no noticeable impact. In this cutscene, for example, you'll see ray tracing creates a better hair shadow onto Amicia's face, but the rest of the shadowing in this scene is virtually unchanged. This sort of small improvement is difficult to notice during actual gameplay, and for most people I think enabling ray tracing is near to pointless. This is a good looking game regardless of whether the setting is enabled or not. The F1 series of games has slowly increased the amount of ray tracing effects over time, with F1 24 including ray traced shadows, ambient occlusion, global illumination, and reflections. In this comparison, I've enabled all of these settings and changed the ray tracing quality setting to either medium, which is the lowest option, or high, which is the highest option. The problem with including ray tracing in a game like F1 24 is that while it does improve the overall visual quality, you'll be pretty hard pressed to notice this during actual gameplay. For example, while the game has ray traced reflections, you don't get zero reflections in the non-ray traced mode. Can you tell which of these examples is ray tracing? You have to look at subtle clues and environment details to really nail down which is using ray traced reflections. Yes, trackside building windows have reflections with ray tracing enabled, but did you notice that during the race? I'd say probably not, and the same applies to the other effects that are enabled, like ray traced shadows and ambient occlusion. These effects provide more realistic shadowing around cars, but were you really able to notice that at first glance? In fast-paced games like this, where you are focusing on specific areas of the screen to play, and where the overall visual quality isn't improved to the level of being realistic, I mean, one glance at some of the environments outside the track kind of exposes this game, it isn't that necessary to use ray tracing, and ultimately you'll basically need to pixel peep to spot the differences. Get ready for some awful Fortnite gameplay, because we're about to explore the differences between hardware ray tracing on and off. Both of these images utilize Unreal Engine's Lumen feature, but we're focusing on whether the advantages of using hardware acceleration is worth it, given software Lumen doesn't require dedicated ray tracing hardware. Can you spot the differences between hardware RT on and off? This is another example where it's quite difficult to tell which of these is the hardware ray tracing implementation, and that's because Fortnite has an excellent software Lumen implementation. Turning on hardware ray tracing improves the accuracy and resolution of reflections noticeably, turning things that were blobs into more defined reflections. You'll get more accurate reflections of your own character on surfaces. This is largely missing without hardware acceleration. But again, the software implementation also has quite nice and usable reflections for the most part. It's questionable whether you'd notice this in regular competitive gameplay, though it's going to be more impactful in the creative modes and stuff like LEGO Fortnite. There's also improvements to lighting quality, including better and more accurate ambient occlusion and self-shadowing. I spotted some instances where software Lumen wouldn't correctly render a shadow, such as under cars for example, whereas you get a more realistic presentation with hardware Lumen enabled. We're largely talking about small differences though, there just isn't much separating the two images unless you go nitpicking. Dragon's Dogma II is a 2024 release that uses ray-traced lighting, which appears to mean some form of global illumination as ray tracing does not impact reflections. This is another example of ray tracing changing the way the game looks noticeably, but not necessarily providing an obviously better image. Take this example in the main town. Which of these images is using ray tracing and which of these is visually better? I think the answer to that is not immediately clear. It turns out the image with brighter houses is the ray traced image, but subjectively I think the other non-ray traced image looks better. Here's another example, this time indoors at night. Now in this example, it's actually the darker image with better ambient occlusion that's the one with ray tracing enabled. What about through this cutscene? Not a ton of substantial differences from switching on ray traced lighting. It's really only in specific scenes where the game benefits from ray tracing, such as in this forest scene I captured, where at least in my opinion the ray tracing version is better and more natural. But for every scene where you can clearly see the benefits like this, I could produce more where there is either no change or where the benefits are unclear. I don't think it matters all that much whether you use ray tracing or not in this title, and I could see reasons for and against. Star Wars Jedi Survivor implements ray tracing through a single toggle, which appears to combine multiple effects including reflections and lighting. In most scenes, this changes the way the game looks noticeably, but doesn't necessarily improve it to the point where you'd be able to pick out the ray traced image straight away. Take this indoor scene looking at a workbench. Which of these examples is ray traced? The one where light bars cast light onto the rocks behind might indicate that is ray tracing, but the other image has more contact shadowing and ambient occlusion under the bench. There's clear differences in the metallic overhead object as well, but this is the answer and I don't think it's obvious which of these is superior and neither look photoreal in their lighting. Turning on ray tracing does enhance reflections in some situations, but not always. This river stream has better reflections with ray tracing enabled, but in this next scene there isn't much of a difference, with most reflections provided through what appears to be rasterization. And in this next scene on Coruscant, enabling ray tracing improves reflections closer to the camera, but removes some reflections for items further away. Whether or not this is an improvement overall, it's hard to say, and I think that's the main issue with how ray tracing works in Jedi Survivor. Another example is that a lot of foliage self-shadowing and ambient occlusion is removed with ray tracing enabled. Again, I'm not sure which is more accurate or realistic, but ultimately it's probably somewhere between the two options that are shown here. So I don't think ray tracing is essential in this game, and you get a pretty good visual experience without it. Atomic Heart is an interesting example, having added ray-traced reflections and ambient occlusion via a patch this year. What specific setting you use in the game has a drastic effect on the game's presentation relative to the max atomic setting. For example, using the Performance RTX mode, that deletes a whole bunch of reflections that you get with the standard rasterized version of the game. This makes the presentation significantly worse despite using ray tracing, so this is a clear example of ray tracing hurting visuals. However, when cranking up ray tracing to the maximum quality mode, surfaces are enhanced with better, higher resolution and more accurate reflections. There's also a minor impact from the improved ambient occlusion, but you're most likely to notice the increased reflection quality throughout the game, particularly on shinier surfaces like marble, metal, and glass. Water is unaffected. The downside to this is noise in these reflections, and this is true whether you're using native TAA rendering or DLSS. While the reflection quality is enhanced and in general the game looks better for it, the reflections themselves are more noisy than the regular rasterization mode, which is a downgrade of sorts. So ray tracing in this game isn't a complete success on maximum settings. Another game with ray tracing that improves visuals but at the expense of artifacts is Hogwarts Legacy. This game features ray traced shadows, ambient occlusion, and reflections, and for these examples I turned all settings on and adjusted overall ray tracing quality to either low or ultra. The lowest ray tracing configuration doesn't do a whole lot. You get a minor improvement to reflections, but the amount is so limited and the resolution so low that it's not a huge step forward from the game's rasterized reflections. Small differences in ambient occlusion and shadows make the game look a bit different to the rasterized presentation, but in most situations it isn't noticeably better, with more differences attributable to minor time of day changes compared to actual ray tracing improvements. When turning up ray tracing quality to Ultra, this is where we see a noticeable step up for shadow and reflection quality. Shadows are higher resolution, sharper and better, so that's a win on top of ambient occlusion changes. Reflections are now applied to many more surfaces and reflect things the rasterized presentation does not. This creates a striking change to the way the game looks. It's certainly noticeable, especially indoors, and at least in my opinion, having reflections applied to these surfaces makes the game look better. However, this comes at a cost. These reflections are a low resolution, they're grainy, blurry, and have plenty of artifacts. So while enabling the maximum level of ray tracing in the game does have visual benefits, the amount of artifacts can be distracting and takes away from the goal of ray tracing, which is to improve visual quality overall. Hogwarts Legacy isn't quite at that level and should have used higher resolution reflections. We'll play another game of Spot the Ray Tracing here with Hitman 3, aka Hitman World of Assassination, which implements ray traced reflections and sun shadows. Get your guesses in for this first example because it's not immediately obvious which one has ray tracing enabled. In fact, it's the left image. This next one should be more obvious, even though both do feature reflections. The giveaway is the higher reflection resolution behind the waiter. This next one is more challenging if you don't spot the immediate giveaway. One image has higher ground reflection resolution and a bit more definition at times, but that's actually not the one that uses ray tracing. The giveaway for ray tracing here is we get transparent reflections with ray tracing enabled, but no reflections on those surfaces at all with it disabled. Though I will admit the regular ground reflections look better than the ray traced reflections. In the next scene, you can use the knowledge you've just gained to spot the ray tracing image pretty quickly. Again, the one with reflections on glass is the one using ray tracing, and there's also an improvement to shadow quality with ray tracing enabled, though it is minor. This next one though, get your guesses in. If you thought the higher reflection resolution on the ground was the one with ray tracing, you'd be wrong. That's actually the game's normal rasterized reflections. The less defined reflections are ray tracing in this example. And this next example is pretty difficult to tell, and then the final example, we can again look closely at transparent reflections to uncover which of the images is utilizing ray tracing. So overall, Hitman 3 is in this weird position where ray tracing enhances the presentation for some elements, such as reflections off transparent objects, and it improves the accuracy of reflections in some other circumstances, but this is accompanied by a clear reduction in reflection resolution for some ground reflections where the game's rasterized reflections simply look better. In most scenes, I think the ray traced image looks slightly better, but it does come at the cost of increased artifacts for those ground reflections. Guardians of the Galaxy focuses on ray traced reflections. The lowest setting is reflections on high, and with everything cranked up, you get higher resolution reflections in addition to reflections on transparent surfaces. This is very much a game where if you're looking at a surface that benefits from reflections, ray tracing does a better and more accurate job than screen space reflections. If you're not specifically looking at those surfaces, or if the scene just doesn't have many of them, ray tracing has little to no impact. Turning everything up to Ultra and turning on ray-traced transparent reflections does have a bigger impact on the presentation, as you're more likely to see a surface with ray tracing applied. These reflections look pretty good and are at a decent resolution. With ray tracing on the minimum level, the resolution is worse, but it's still usable and not distracting with generally better reflections than the rasterized version of the game. This is the sort of title I'd want to play with ray tracing enabled, as it improves visual quality even if it isn't transformative of the presentation overall. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart implements ray-traced reflections, shadows, and ambient occlusion. Like games such as Guardians of the Galaxy and Doom Eternal, how much of a difference this makes depends on the exact scene you are looking at. Some of the more sci-fi environments with lots of glass and metals benefit significantly from the inclusion of ray-traced reflections, with more accurate reflections and additional reflections on surfaces like glass. Other sections of the game, where there are surfaces ray tracing is not applied to, benefit less from this feature, so it depends what part of the game you're looking at. Generally though, when ray tracing is cranked up to the highest settings, there's a net benefit to the presentation. Reflections are significantly improved, and there's also improvements to shadowing at times thanks to ray traced shadows and ambient occlusion. This is much less noticeable than the reflection improvement, but there are certainly times this combines with reflections to create a more natural and realistic lighting system. When all ray tracing settings are enabled but set to the lowest level, Rift Apart still benefits from ray tracing, but the presentation can be a bit noisy at times, especially for ambient occlusion. In this scene, for example, the quality of ambient occlusion is more accurate with ray tracing set to medium, but this effect is noisy and distracting. However, even the lowest level of ray traced reflections is generally an improvement, so you could just disable shadows and ambient occlusion in this situation. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt is one of the more unusual games I'm examining because it was released in 2015, well before ray tracing capable GPUs were launched, yet received an update more than 7 years after release to add in ray tracing features. Specifically, we get ray traced reflections, global illumination, ambient occlusion, and shadows. While this is a heavy use of ray tracing, because many of the game assets are from an older game, no amount of ray tracing can make The Witcher 3 look close to photoreal, it just doesn't have the required asset quality. Nevertheless, ray tracing generally improves the visual appearance of the game, especially when it comes to shadowing. Rasterization in the game using the Ultra Plus preset looks pretty dated from a shadow, ambient occlusion, and global illumination perspective. Turning on ray tracing even to the minimum level, which is with global illumination set to performance, it makes quite a substantial difference in some scenes, and this isn't a situation where it's not clear which is better. Ray traced global illumination almost always improves the way the game looks, though some scenes are much less affected than others, so there are times where the benefit is negligible. Cranking everything up to maximum improves more aspects to the presentation, including reflections, which are higher resolution and more realistic, shadows, which are more accurate and extensive with more objects casting shadows, and ambient occlusion with more realistic self-shadowing. With this level of ray tracing, the game does look better. However, I wouldn't say it's essential to play the game this way because the standard rasterized version of the game looks fine and gives you a look that matches the asset quality, if that makes sense. Rasterization fits well with this style of game made in 2015. There were also a couple of examples where ray tracing hurt visuals, such as this indoor pub scene. With rasterized visuals, there is a clear difference between nighttime and daytime inside the pub. When ray tracing is used, both scenes are very dark and the daytime scene looks like night. Occasionally, when games like this are retrofit with ray tracing, lighting in every scene hasn't necessarily been tweaked or crafted to look the way that it should. Spider-Man includes ray-traced reflections, and this is a title where reflections have a big impact on the presentation because there are so many surfaces where reflections are applied. The ground, especially shinier parts or puddles, windows on all the buildings, and cars, they're all enhanced with ray-traced reflections enabled, and these elements are in pretty much every scene throughout the game as you're swinging around the city. It's a noticeable improvement, and this applies even when using the absolute minimum level of ray tracing in the game with all ray traced settings on the lowest level. Cranking up ray tracing to the highest level improves the resolution of reflections as well as the draw distance for geometry. There are some situations where on the lowest setting the amount of geometry that's reflected is similar to the cube map reflections used on Windows, but when using the maximum amount of ray tracing, reflection quality is pretty much always enhanced and so delivers the best visual quality. Metro Exodus is a really interesting example because there are two versions of the game. The original, which was released in 2019 that has a non-ray trace mode, and an option to enable ray-traced global illumination and ambient occlusion. Then later in 2021, 4A Games released Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, which is the same game but with an overhauled lighting system that always enables ray tracing and includes both global illumination and reflections, among other lighting effects. In the standard version of the game, ray tracing doesn't do a great deal for the overall presentation. It does change the way lighting behaves, but in many scenes the differences are negligible and not a clear improvement on the base non-ray traced image. At times, elements may look a little darker, at times other elements may look a little lighter, but it's not a situation where you turn ray tracing on and the game looks significantly more realistic. It's a minor improvement at best. However, with the Enhanced Edition, the overhauled lighting system and more widespread use of ray tracing significantly improves how the game looks. When you put the original 2019 release up against the Enhanced Edition, it's a night and day difference in a lot of environments, with the Enhanced Edition clearly producing a more realistic image with better lighting and reflections. The standard version of the game, even with ray tracing set to Ultra, looks a bit dated in comparison to how the Enhanced Edition renders the game, so there is no doubting here that the Enhanced Edition is the ultimate way to play with completely transformed visuals. And the good news is that even with the ray trace settings set to their lowest level in the Enhanced Edition, which is ray tracing on normal and reflections on hybrid, the game still gives you almost the same experience as those settings on the maximum level. The Ultra experience is slightly better, but so long as you're playing the Enhanced Edition, it's a better looking version of the game relative to the base game without ray tracing, and as I said, I think it's transformative. Alan Wake 2 is one of the best examples of ray tracing delivering stunning visuals. The game utilizes path-traced lighting with various different effects across the game's ray tracing presets. I'm focusing on low, which enables direct lighting but disables path-traced indirect lighting, as well as high, which turns everything up to the maximum level. Now, the game's rasterized presentation, which does use some software ray tracing techniques, it looks excellent. But when turning on path tracing, especially on the high preset, the game is transformed with more realistic lighting. Unlike some of the other games I've assessed, I think this is a clear example of ray tracing being used to make the game obviously more realistic, and it's most noticeable when going backwards. When you turn ray tracing off, after being accustomed to how the path traced mode looks, the less accurate and realistic lighting system is exposed as being a bit of trickery. The degree to which path tracing transforms the visuals depends on the exact scene you were looking at, which has been the case for many ray trace games. But particularly when looking at indoor lighting, path tracing enables better and more accurate reflections, higher quality shadows, and much more natural light fall off and interactions with surfaces, which leads to a stunning experience when used on the high preset. Outdoors, the differences are less pronounced, but it was rare for me to prefer the standard version of the game. Indoors, I had a clear preference for full path tracing. Enabling ray tracing on low gets you halfway between the base version of the game and high path tracing. This configuration benefits from noticeably better shadow quality and adds reflections on transparent objects, but misses out on other improvements to reflections and global illumination. I think this mode is an overall improvement relative to ray tracing disabled, and in some scenes you should be able to notice the difference, but it isn't as transformative as the maximum path trace mode. Overall though, this is one of the best examples of ray tracing, and with it enabled, it's rare to find a better looking game. And finally, we get to Cyberpunk 2077, the 37th game that we've looked at in this video. This game has a wide variety of ray traced settings, including normal, ray traced reflections, shadows, and lighting, aka global illumination and ambient occlusion, in addition to a path traced overdrive mode. I'm using the ray trace settings that are enabled when using the ray tracing low, ultra, and overdrive presets, so low only has local shadows enabled, ultra has everything on, and overdrive enables path tracing. To get it out of the way quickly, the low setting is pretty pointless with a very limited impact to visuals as it only improves shadows cast from artificial lights. It's unlikely you will notice much of a difference using this configuration, so low is much closer to off than any of the other settings. Ultra ray tracing, in most circumstances, is a significant and noticeable improvement to the visuals. Reflections do a lot of the heavy lifting here, significantly improving the quality of reflections across many surfaces, including transparencies which don't really have reflections at all without ray tracing. When looking at the ultra ray tracing mode relative to ray tracing off, this is the thing you'll most likely notice. However, in addition to this, we get major benefits to lighting quality, including more realistic shadows indoors and outdoors, along with better light fall-off and global illumination. In most situations, this makes the ultra ray tracing mode look noticeably better than ray tracing off, but it's not always the case. Some scenes benefit very little and still look quite close to the standard rasterized configuration, though I'd say this is rare and usually in situations which have very few reflective surfaces. But when jumping up to the path tracing mode, aka overdrive, this is where the visuals of Cyberpunk 2077 were transformed significantly. I was able to capture a couple of scenes where overdrive basically makes Cyberpunk look like a completely different game, with ultra ray tracing even looking dated in comparison. This is difficult to achieve as generally Cyberpunk 2077 looks great, but in my opinion, path tracing is a huge transformation that affects nearly every aspect of the game in a positive way. The biggest improvement to lighting quality is similar to what is seen in Alan Wake 2. Lighting is simply more natural and realistic with path tracing enabled, and it's when you go back to a non-path traced image that this becomes painfully obvious. It's almost a subconscious thing that draws you into the visuals, and there is no doubting that for the best visual experience in the game and one of the best experiences you can get on PC overall, you'll want to play this game on the overdrive settings. I think this, along with Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong, provides a strong look into the future of graphics on the PC platform, which I believe will head more down the path of path tracing. So that's a mammoth look at ray tracing across a huge number of games, and if you watch the extended edition of this video right through all 37 game examples, then kudos to you. I think this covers most types of ray tracing you'll find in today's games, and I've tried to look at as many major ray traced releases as is feasible in a single video, though I'm sure some people will say, why didn't you test this game? Why didn't you test that game? Again, we tested 37 of them. There's probably a few that we missed. Now we can get into the summary and analysis. Here I've sorted all 37 games into the 8 categories I talked about at the start, ranging from the worst ray tracing implementations to the best. I've also put in multiple configurations because there are games where the lowest amount of ray tracing delivers a significantly different experience to the maximum amount of ray tracing. In total, this means there were 61 game configurations assessed and compared to the standard rasterized presentation on the maximum or ultra in-game settings. There's a few things to break down here. Firstly, there's only a couple of titles where ray tracing either isn't noticeable or hurts visuals. In 5 of these games, including both Resident Evil titles and Dead Space, this is just the ray tracing configuration you get, with no settings improving it to make it more noticeable. In another 3 configurations, ray tracing had no impact, only on the lowest settings. The most common type of ray tracing that popped up is ray tracing that required pixel peeping or close examinations to tell if it was on. In 8 titles, this was the absolute best experience you could achieve, and in another 4 titles, this is the experience you get on the lowest ray tracing settings. In my opinion, there is no point turning on ray tracing if you can't immediately tell that it's on and benefiting the presentation. This grouping also tended to include faster paced and multiplayer games, including all of the driving games. I just wasn't overly impressed with ray tracing in driving games, which have generally featured good quality reflections for ages, and in other multiplayer titles like Battlefield 2042 and Fortnite, the differences with ray tracing on were too subtle to make any sort of difference while actually playing the game in a multiplayer setting. We're just not in a position yet where ray tracing is having much effect on multiplayer titles, and most games don't even bother including it. In 6 other games, I felt ray tracing changed the image, but not to a degree where I could easily tell which image was ray traced or not. A couple of other configurations in this tier were reduced ray tracing quality from other titles. In my opinion, if ray tracing merely changes the way lighting is implemented in a game, but doesn't clearly make it look better or more realistic to an average observer, its inclusion is pointless and not worth enabling. In most of these games, it would be difficult to tell if ray tracing was an actual technical advancement or just a stylistic change from a filter that the developers wanted to implement. A small number of titles also had problems producing ray tracing without also introducing artifacts. Noise is a problem in games like Hogwarts Legacy and Atomic Heart on the maximum ray tracing settings, and other titles like Ratchet and Clank, if you turn down ray tracing too much, noise becomes a bit distracting at times. Some of the time you could justify using ray tracing in these games, but it's not a clear win depending on what you like a game to look like. There are lots of people that absolutely hate instability and blurriness, in which case these configurations won't be good enough. In these bottom 5 categories, my opinion is that you probably shouldn't enable ray tracing in most instances. This encompasses the best quality ray traced settings available in 22 of the 37 games looked at, which is about 60% of the games. In the remaining 15 games, or 40% of the titles assessed, ray tracing is typically worth using because it provides a noticeable visual improvement and doesn't introduce other downsides. On the lower end of these good ray traced games, we have titles that benefit from ray tracing on some surfaces, usually due to reflections. These are games where you won't always see the improvements, but when you do see what ray tracing brings, it's a clear gain over rasterized visuals, typically fixing issues with the presentation that just can't be solved through more rasterization. The upper 2 categories I describe as having a major impact, where switching ray tracing on is so obvious and impacts most scenes throughout the game in a positive way. There were 11 game examples of this, so 30% of the time ray tracing had a major impact across the games I assessed. Occasionally, there were titles like Watch Dogs Legion and Control, where even on the lowest ray tracing settings, the game still benefits significantly from turning it on. Other titles like Dying Light 2 and Cyberpunk 2077, you'll want to avoid the lower settings, but when used on ultra ray tracing, the difference relative to rasterization is very noticeable. I think there's a clear hierarchy of types of ray tracing and how beneficial it is to a game. Path tracing is at the top of this hierarchy, usually offering significant gains to the point of transforming the experience. When all or most light sources in a scene are contributing to ray tracing, and when there's a healthy dose of reflectivity and ray bounces, you get the most natural and realistic presentation. This just cannot be beaten by rasterization in modern games. For individual ray tracing effects, by far the most noticeable effect is ray traced reflections. Rasterized reflections have plenty of issues. For example, screen space reflections can't reflect objects outside the field of view. They usually have ugly artifacts and don't work well on transparent surfaces. Cube maps generally are low accuracy. Planar reflections are limited in where they can be deployed. Ray traced reflections look great when implemented properly and resolve many of these limitations to make them the most realistic and impactful way to implement this effect. In many titles, ray traced reflections are an obvious visual improvement, so in games where there are multiple ray tracing settings to choose from, I'll always enable reflections first. Global illumination is somewhere in the middle of effectiveness. In some games, global illumination doesn't obviously improve the visual quality and ends up just making the game look different without necessarily being better. In other games, global illumination is of significant benefit, though this is rarer and usually in games that combine ray-traced global illumination with other effects. In my opinion, to get realistic and accurate lighting, you need to go all the way to path tracing. In many titles, ray-traced global illumination just isn't enough to shift the needle significantly. Then at the bottom are the ray-traced effects I generally think are pointless by themselves: shadows and ambient occlusion. Rasterization is really good at these things, even if it's not quite accurate, so enabling ray-traced shadows and AO often makes little to no difference. The games that only integrate ray-traced shadows usually ended up with unnecessary ray tracing that's not worth enabling. It's only when these effects are combined with other forms of ray tracing do these make any sense to enable, and honestly, I don't think developers should bother with ray tracing if they're only going to end up with a crappy ray-traced shadows effect. There's also zero doubt that games with more ray tracing effects look better. If a developer tries to dial back ray tracing because they're worried about the performance cost, that usually leads to ray tracing that has no impact. When developers chuck in tons of ray tracing or even path tracing, that's when we see visuals that are much improved. And what's clear about this is games with more ray tracing and better ray tracing implementations are usually sponsored by NVIDIA. That doesn't necessarily mean they use NVIDIA developed RT effects, but often they have an NVIDIA logo on the splash screen and are cross-marketed with GeForce products. On the other hand, titles that are AMD sponsored typically have worse ray tracing implementations, especially games from the first few years of ray tracing. Angry AMD fanboys will probably say that NVIDIA sponsored games have added in more ray tracing to cripple the experience on AMD GPUs, but I don't think that's the case. Visually, these games are just better, and it's been shown here that more ray-traced effects in a game delivers a larger visual improvement. There aren't many examples of titles that include tons of ray tracing for little visual benefit, and lighter ray-traced implementations usually struggle to compete with the visual gains that more ray tracing can provide. Whether or not individual games are well optimized from a performance standpoint is something that we'll look at in part 2. Are ray tracing games getting better over time? There are certainly more titles being released with ray tracing now than there were back in 2019 and 2020. Not all modern games are utilizing ray tracing, and there are some stunning examples that don't, but it's pretty common for a modern AAA title to include a ray traced configuration these days. I would say this started to become more common at the end of 2022 and start of 2023, so about 4 years into the availability of ray tracing GPUs. Over time though, there hasn't been a noticeable trend of improved ray tracing quality in more recent releases. Now granted, I haven't tested every single game released across these years, but of the titles I assessed, it's pretty similar year by year, and I wouldn't say the data supports games improving or getting worse. Each year we seem to be getting a bunch of good implementations and a bunch of not so good implementations. Speaking purely from a visual perspective, I have mixed feelings about ray tracing. When games utilize ray tracing well, they look stunning, and it's clear that ray tracing is the future of game visuals. But the number of titles where we get these stunning visuals isn't very high, and the amount of ray tracing that's required to deliver stunning visuals is very high, which has performance implications we'll explore in part 2. For multiplayer gamers, ray tracing is basically irrelevant. There's just not enough examples of multiplayer titles utilizing ray tracing, and the impact of ray tracing in those games is usually insignificant. As things stand in 2024, there is no point purchasing a graphics card for its ray tracing capabilities if you primarily play multiplayer titles. For single-player gamers, it really depends on the sorts of games you play as to whether ray tracing is something to prioritize from a visual standpoint or not. Across the last few years, there's only been a handful of major game releases per year where ray tracing is really worth using, and a bunch more where the impact is questionable. It's possible that you just won't play that many games where ray tracing makes a difference. But if you're the sort of gamer that loves the best visual experiences and you do enjoy playing titles like Cyberpunk 2077, Alan Wake 2, and Black Myth Wukong, then having a card with strong ray tracing performance is essential. I think this is going to become more essential as time goes on. I think the best looking games released in the next few years will probably be ray trace games, but it's very hard to predict the future. At least we're at the point today where an okay percentage of major ray trace games actually use ray tracing well, and with 6 years of releases now, there's at least a small pool of games that show off ray tracing in a positive light. This isn't a DLSS situation though, where the feature is widely applicable and beneficial to most gamers. Upscaling has been a massive improvement this generation. It's now found in the vast majority of game releases, and ray tracing just isn't on that level yet in terms of the visual benefits it provides and the number of great examples. We're slowly getting there, but 6 years in, I don't think ray tracing has been a must-buy feature up until this point for the majority of gamers. For some gamers, yes, but not the majority. With that said, I think it will become more significant for the upcoming generation of graphics card releases. If you're buying a new GPU in 2025, you'll probably want it to last for at least 3 years of gaming, and in the next 3 years we're going to see a boatload more ray trace games if current trends continue, and at least some of those will be great examples of ray tracing. We're also entering an era where most releases will have been fully developed in the ray tracing era with access to ray tracing capable hardware. So like I said, I think this feature will be more essential in the next few years. It's kind of like the situation with 8GB GPUs. A couple of years ago, there were just a few examples of 8GB being insufficient for mid-range and high-end products. A couple of games that would use more than 8GB on maximum settings. The signs were there, and now we're seeing many more examples of this, but obviously not all games are impacted yet. Ray tracing is following this trend. Right now, there are a few examples where ray tracing is really significantly improving the visual quality, and we're seeing signs of it being an important feature in the upcoming generation, even if it hasn't fully been realized yet. Before I analyze this any further, we'll have to look at performance, so stay tuned for the ray tracing performance comparison and evaluation in the next week or so. Still plenty of interesting things to go over, but for now, that's it for this incredibly long video. Thanks to everyone that has watched this video to the end, especially those that watched the extended cut of this video. It was quite long, so good effort to you guys for reaching the end. If you do want to watch that, it is available for our Hardware Unboxed supporters, either via Patreon or via YouTube channel membership, so check that out if you want to see all the data, all the comparisons that went into this video, fully narrated with all of my analysis and stuff. That's in the full cut of the video. We really do appreciate everyone that supports the channel directly, because it takes a lot of time and energy and effort to make these sorts of videos, these in-depth analysis. Steve has recently been doing that with his motherboard roundups and videos like that. I've been doing it with this sort of video, and I think ray tracing is going to be a very important topic for 2025 graphics card releases, so it's important that we have this sort of in-depth analysis, our current position on ray tracing, looking at everything, the sorts of games that we need to be looking at, and so on. So if you appreciate these in-depth looks at things, then yeah, please consider becoming a Hardware Unboxed supporter. So yeah, as you can hear, my voice is probably a little scratchy now. For some reason, I decided to record this whole video in one go. Don't know why I did that. Probably a bit of a mistake because my voice is now screwed. But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.